I settled into the cabin deep in the North Cascades of Washington, somewhere far from the busier trails and roads. It was the fall of 1997, and I was 24 years old. I had always wanted a break from city life. Seattle had been wearing me down with its gray skies and crowded streets. So I rented this small, rustic cabin for a week, just me alone, to disconnect and recharge. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick forest, near a small lake that reflected the changing colors of the leaves. The cabin itself was simple, made of weathered cedar logs, with a stone chimney and a sturdy wooden door that creaked when I opened it. The inside was sparse but cozy, a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area with a metal sink, a narrow table, and two mismatched chairs. A single bed with a thin mattress sat against one wall, and there were shelves lined with old books and some dusty cooking pots. The windows were thick glass panes, showing me the dense forest just outside, where the trees were already turning yellow and orange. The first day was quiet, peaceful even. I unpacked my few things and stacked firewood by the door. I made a simple meal of canned beans heated over the stove and sat by the window, watching the light fade as the sun dipped behind the hills. The lake was calm and smooth, a perfect mirror. I had brought a journal with me, planning to write a little each day, but mostly I just stared out into the forest. That night, the wind picked up. I remember hearing it whistle softly through the cracks in the logs, rustling the dry leaves piled outside. I felt safe, though. The cabin was solid, and I had plenty of food and water. I went to bed early, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, and drifted off. The second day, I decided to explore the area a bit. There was a faint trail near the cabin that wound through the trees and led down to the lake shore. The air was sharp and smelled of pine and damp earth. I walked slowly, stopping often to listen. There were birds I didn't recognize and the distant call of a hawk. The forest was quiet but alive. I even spotted a deer grazing near the edge of the clearing. When I returned, I started a fire in the wood stove and boiled water for coffee. The cabin felt warmer and more like home. I opened one of the old books from the shelf. It was a guide to wild plants in the Pacific Northwest. I read about edible berries and herbs while the rain began to patter softly against the roof. That rain turned into a steady drizzle by nightfall. The sound was soothing at first, a gentle tapping that made the cabin feel snug and protected. But as the night deepened, the wind howled louder, shaking the windows. At one point, a loud crack echoed outside. It sounded like a tree limb breaking under the weight of water or wind. I sat up, heart beating faster. I looked out the window but saw only swaying shadows of the tall firs. I told myself it was just the storm, nothing more. I checked the door locks and closed the curtains tightly. The old cabin felt a bit less cozy in the wild storm, but I was determined to stay calm. On the third morning, the rain had stopped. The forest smelled fresh and wet, with mist curling around the trees. I noticed some broken branches near the cabin, maybe from the storm. I collected firewood from the pile and went to check the lake. The water was rougher now, waves lapping at the shore and stirring up fallen leaves. As I walked back, I felt a strange unease. There was a faint smell, like smoke, but I didn't see any fire. Then I noticed something odd near the edge of the forest. Footprints. They were fresh and too large to be mine. I froze, my breath catching. The prints were deep in the soft ground, heading away from the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or some animal, but the shape was wrong, more like a heavy boot print. And the prints were spaced like someone walking upright, not a four-legged creature. I didn't want to believe someone else was nearby. I had thought this place was isolated. Back at the cabin, I double-checked the locks and inspected the windows carefully. I thought about calling someone, but the phone lines didn't work here. I didn't have a cell phone either. This was 1997, and this cabin was so remote I couldn't even get a signal if I had one. That night, I slept lightly. Every creak of the cabin and rustle of the trees made me jump. I left the wood stove burning low, just enough to keep the place warm. I kept the door locked and placed a heavy chair against it for extra security. The fourth day, I tried to push the strange feeling away. I gathered more firewood and made a small path cleared around the cabin to see better outside. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I kept noticing small things out of place. twigs broken near the window, leaves scattered as if someone had brushed past. At one point, I saw a faint shadow moving between the trees. It disappeared quickly when I looked up. I told myself it was just my imagination or a squirrel, but I felt watched. That afternoon, I found something even more unsettling. Near the back of the cabin, in the dirt, were fresh cigarette butts. I don't smoke, and there was no sign of anyone around before. Whoever had been here was careless or trying to leave a mark. I didn't want to think about what that meant. I considered packing up and leaving, but I had only a few days left and was stubborn. I was here to be alone, to disconnect. But now that solitude felt invaded. That night, the wind was calm again. The moon was bright, shining through the thin clouds and casting long shadows on the forest floor. I sat by the window with a flashlight and a hunting knife from the kitchen drawer beside me. My hands shook as I scanned the tree line. Suddenly, I heard something. Footsteps crunching on dry leaves, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. I moved to the door, peeking through the peephole. I saw a figure standing just beyond the porch steps, half hidden by the darkness. The man was tall, wearing a hooded jacket and jeans. His face was mostly hidden in shadow, but his eyes caught the light from my porch lamp. I didn't open the door. Instead, I grabbed the heavy chair and jammed it against the handle. I kept my breath shallow, the knife ready. The man stayed still for a moment, then turned and vanished into the woods. I waited until I was sure he was gone before slowly locking all the doors and windows again. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to every sound. The next day was a blur of anxiety. I didn't want to leave, but I also didn't want to stay and risk another visit. I packed my bags quietly, trying not to make noise. Before leaving, I checked around the cabin one last time. There were more footprints in the soft soil, some leading into the forest and some coming closer. I found a scrap of paper stuck in a bush near the back porch, a crude drawing of the cabin with a circle around it, and a word scratched underneath, "Watch." I swallowed hard and felt the weight of being truly alone out here. But I didn't panic. I had prepared for emergencies, and I knew the nearby ranger station was about a mile down the forest road. I started walking, keeping my eyes on the trail and the shadows. I stayed alert, listening for any signs of the man. The forest seemed quieter now, almost too quiet. My heart still raced, but I moved steadily, clutching my knife in my pocket. After about an hour, I reached the ranger station. It was a small wooden building with a satellite phone outside. I called the local sheriff and reported everything. The footprints, the cigarette butts, the man lurking outside the cabin, and the threatening note. The sheriff said they would send a patrol to check the area immediately. They advised me to stay at the station until they arrived. I agreed gratefully. A few hours later, 2 deputies arrived and drove me back to the cabin. We searched the surroundings carefully but found no sign of the man. They found some discarded trash, but nothing else. They told me someone might have been trespassing or hunting illegally. They assured me they would increase patrols in the area. I decided not to stay in the cabin any longer. The peace I came for was broken. I felt safer with people around and left the cabin behind for good. The experience stayed with me for years. I never saw the man again, but I never forgot the feeling of being watched in the wilderness, the silence turning from peaceful to threatening. In the end, I learned something important about solitude. It's not always what you expect. Sometimes, being alone means facing the unknown in its rawest form, with nothing but your own instincts to protect you. But I also learned to trust those instincts, to prepare, and to never ignore the small signs around you. The forest can be beautiful, but it can also be dangerous. And some dangers come not from nature, but from people. That trip changed me. It taught me caution, respect, and the value of connection, even in the loneliest places. I never went back to that cabin, but every time I see a forest, I remember that week. The quiet, the fear, and the strength it took to walk away safe and sound. I first found the cabin by accident, or maybe it was fate, but that's how it always feels with places like that. It was early autumn of 2018 when I decided to take a break from everything. My name is Marcus, I was 28 then, and living in Spokane, Washington. Work had become a constant grind. Long hours in an office with no windows, endless emails, and a boss who never seemed satisfied. I needed to get away from the noise, the pressure, and the crowded city life. I wanted silence, fresh air, and nothing but nature. I'd always liked hiking and camping, but I was never much of a social person, so I usually went alone. This time, I wanted something more permanent for a few days, a place where I could think clearly without distractions. That's when I started looking online for cabins to rent somewhere remote. I stumbled upon an old listing for a cabin near a small town called Elam, about an hour and a half from Seattle. The photos looked rough but cozy. A little wooden shack nestled in a dense pine forest, close to a small lake. No electricity, no internet, just a wood stove and a well. The description was vague, but it promised privacy and peace, exactly what I wanted. The price was low, probably because it was off the grid and hard to get to. I booked it without hesitation. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The road ended in a narrow gravel path, which I followed through tall trees thick with red and gold leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. After a bumpy drive, I saw the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, maybe 20 by 15 feet, with weathered logs and a rusty metal roof. A small porch with a creaky wooden bench faced the lake, which was calm and shimmering in the fading sunlight. The door opened with a groan. Inside, the space was simple. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a small table, a cot with a thin mattress, and a few shelves filled with dusty cans and an old kerosene lantern. There was a bucket toilet outside and a small pump for water near the back. No phone signal, no power lines, just silence. I unpacked slowly. I'd brought some canned food, a few books, a journal, and my camera. After setting some wood in the stove and lighting a small fire, I sat on the porch watching the lake turn pink with the sunset. The first night was quiet. I heard the wind through the trees, the occasional bird call, and the soft splash of water against the shore. I slept with the door slightly open to hear the night sounds better, feeling strangely safe despite being alone. The next day, I explored the area. The forest around the cabin was thick with pine, fir, and cedar. The ground was soft with moss and pine needles. I walked down to the lake's edge and noticed a small dock, half sunken with missing boards. The lake was cold but clear. I found a small trail leading away from the cabin, winding through the trees and up a gentle hill. The view from the top was stunning. The forest stretched for miles, broken only by the lake's blue water and distant mountains capped with early snow. I spent the day hiking and taking photos. The solitude was peaceful. I found a stream nearby and refilled my water bottle. I took out my journal that evening and wrote about the quiet beauty around me. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, beans and rice, and sat by the fire until it was dark. On the third day, the weather changed. The sky was overcast and heavy with clouds. The wind picked up, making the pine trees sway and creak. I stayed inside mostly, reading and writing, but around late afternoon, I noticed something odd. The silence had been replaced by faint noises, something like footsteps crunching on dry leaves, far but definitely close enough to be near the cabin. I stopped what I was doing and listened carefully. The sounds didn't come from animals. I'd been in the woods enough to know the difference between a deer's light steps and something heavier. These were slow, deliberate, and sometimes paused, like someone was watching me. I didn't panic at first. I told myself it was just other hikers or maybe hunters passing by. But then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sounds came closer, moving around the cabin's perimeter. I peeked out through the small window by the door. The woods were dark, shadows stretching between the trees, but I didn't see anyone. I locked the door and pulled the curtains. The wind outside howled and rattled the windows. The footsteps continued, sometimes near the porch, sometimes fading into the distance, then returning. I sat on the cot, heart pounding, trying to stay calm. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal here. The nearest town was miles away, and no one would come out this far in the dark without a real reason. I stayed awake all night, listening and watching. The footsteps never stopped until dawn, when they finally faded away into the morning light. The next few days were tense. The footsteps came back every night, always circling, always just out of sight. I didn't sleep well. I started carrying a heavy hunting knife I found in the cabin's old cupboard. I set up makeshift traps around the porch with branches and cans tied to strings, hoping to alert me if anyone came close. During the days, I stayed near the cabin, only walking the same familiar paths I knew well. I didn't want to get lost or encounter whoever was out there. The feeling of being watched was constant. I caught glimpses of movement through the trees, a flash of dark clothing or a shadow that disappeared as soon as I turned my head. One afternoon, while gathering firewood, I found footprints in the soft mud near the lake. They were large boots, fresh and deep, leading from the woods to the cabin and back again. The prints stopped just outside the door. That night, I couldn't hold it any longer. I knew someone was out there, and they weren't just passing through. I wondered if they were dangerous or just another lost soul like me. I decided to make a plan. The following day, I prepared everything. I gathered my few supplies, loaded the car with everything I needed to leave, and hid the keys in my jacket pocket. I cleaned up the cabin so it wouldn't look abandoned and took down the traps and noisemakers, so whoever was out there wouldn't suspect I was trying to catch them. When night fell again, I sat quietly inside, waiting for the footsteps to start. They came slow and deliberate as always. I kept the door locked and the windows shut. Around midnight, I heard something new, the faint sound of a vehicle engine. It was rough and old, maybe a truck or an ATV, coming from the dirt road I had driven on. The footsteps stopped. The engine grew louder, then faded, then came back again. I realized the person out there had a vehicle and was probably watching the cabin from a distance. Waiting. I didn't want to wait. I needed to leave. I dressed quietly in dark clothes and grabbed my jacket, my phone, and the keys. I waited until the footsteps moved away from the cabin. Then I slipped out the back door, careful to avoid the patches of loose gravel that might make noise. I ran through the trees toward the car. The night was cold and dark, the wind biting my skin. I could hear the faint engine still in the distance, then footsteps rushing closer. Panic hit me like a wave. I broke into a sprint, heart racing, lung burning, reaching the car just as the footsteps reached the edge of the clearing. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The car roared to life and I peeled out down the gravel road. The headlights cut through the dark forest, and I didn't look back. The ride back was tense. I kept checking the rearview mirror for headlights or movement, but the road behind me was empty. Felt like I'd escaped a trap. When I finally reached the main highway and a gas station with bright lights and people, I stopped and called the police. I told them everything, the footsteps, the vehicle, the feeling of being watched. They took the report seriously, but said there had been no other reports of suspicious activity in the area. I stayed in a motel that night, exhausted and shaken. The next day, I returned to Spokane and never went back to that cabin. Months later, I learned from a local news story that the forest around Cle had problems with illegal logging and some people living off the grid who didn't like outsiders. Some had been caught stealing or threatening hikers. It made sense why someone would be watching me, maybe thinking I was a threat or just wanting to scare me off their territory. The whole experience left me with a strong reminder about how vulnerable you can be in the wilderness, even when you think you're alone and safe. Nature itself isn't scary, but people sometimes are, especially when they want to stay hidden. That cabin, those nights, and the footsteps became something I thought about often. It wasn't a ghost or something unreal, just a very real, very human danger I'd encountered in a place meant for peace. I never returned, but I kept a photo of that lake and the pine trees on my desk. It reminded me both of beauty and caution, how even the quietest places can hold secrets, and how sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's out there in the dark, but who's watching from it. It was the autumn of 1997 when I decided to spend a week alone at a small cabin tucked away in the northern woods of Vermont. I was 28 years old, working as a freelance photographer, and I thought a week away from the city noise and deadlines would clear my head and help me find new inspiration. The cabin was nothing fancy. A single-story wooden structure with basic electricity and a propane stove, but it was surrounded by miles of thick forest and rolling hills. I rented it from an older man named Mr. Keenan, who told me the place had been in his family for decades. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun low and red on the horizon. The gravel driveway crunched under the tires as I pulled the old rental car to a stop. I stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive from Boston. The air was cool and sharp, smelling of pine and wet earth. The cabin stood just off the edge of a small clearing, its windows dark and silent. I carried my bags inside, mostly camera gear, some food, and clothes for a week. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and faint smoke from last winter. There was a small living room with a faded couch, a tiny kitchen with a sink, a propane stove, and a rickety wooden table. The bedroom had a bed covered in thick wool blankets and a small dresser. I flipped the light switches. The bulbs buzzed but lit up the rooms dimly. There was a bathroom with a shower, but the water came from a well, so I planned to ration it carefully. After unpacking, I went outside to stretch and look around. The trees stood tall and thick, mostly maple and spruce, their leaves turning red, orange, and yellow. I noticed a narrow dirt path leading from the cabin toward the woods. It looked like it hadn't been used much lately, maybe just for hiking or hunting. The first night was quiet except for the sounds of crickets and a distant owl. I cooked a simple meal on the propane stove and sat by the window with my camera, watching the forest darken. Sleep came easily, but the cabin felt colder than I expected, despite the small heater running all night. The next day, I set out with my camera and backpack to explore the area. I followed the dirt path, noticing small animal tracks in the mud, deer, rabbits, maybe foxes. The forest was dense, but the sun filtered through in golden patches. I stopped often to take pictures of the trees, the moss-covered rocks, and a small creek that gurgled softly. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt a quiet sense of peace. No cars, no voices, just the wind moving the leaves and birds calling far above. I spent hours wandering, sometimes sitting on fallen logs, breathing in the fresh air and framing shots on my camera. By late afternoon, I was tired and decided to head back. When I got close to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The dirt path looked disturbed, as if someone or something had recently walked through. The leaves were scattered and some broken twigs lay across the trail. I thought maybe a hunter or another hiker had been around, but it made me uneasy. I locked the cabin door carefully and settled in for the evening. That night, the quiet was different. I kept hearing soft rustling sounds outside, just beyond the window, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But every time I looked, I saw nothing but the dark trees swaying gently in the wind. I reminded myself I was alone out here and needed to stay calm. On the third day, I decided to hike farther, following a ridge I had seen from the cabin's small porch. The forest became thicker, the ground more uneven. I took my time, making sure I didn't lose my way. I spotted an old hunting blind up on a hill, worn and leaning to one side. I took a few pictures and rested there for a while, feeling the cool breeze. As I started walking back, the sky darkened suddenly. Thick clouds rolled in fast, and the temperature dropped. I hurried down the slope, but soon the rain began. First a drizzle, then a steady downpour. The dirt path turned muddy and slippery. I slipped a few times but managed to stay upright. The cabin felt miles away. By the time I reached the clearing, soaked and chilled, I saw the cabin's windows glowing softly. Relief flooded me. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, dripping water onto the wooden floor. I lit the old wood stove I found stacked near the back porch and started a small fire. The warmth spread quickly, drying my clothes and warming my fingers. That night, the rain hammered on the roof, and the wind shook the cabin's thin walls. I could barely hear myself think over the storm. I took out my notebook and started writing about the day, but the uneasy feeling I had wasn't gone. The fourth day, after the rain cleared, I found strange things around the cabin. A few rocks arranged in a rough circle near the back door, small scratches on the wooden steps, and footprints in the mud that looked too large to be an animal's. The prints didn't look like any shoes I recognized. I felt watched, though I couldn't see anyone. I spent the day inside mostly, trying to ignore the growing tension. I checked the locks on the doors and windows double and triple. I kept my camera close, ready to document anything unusual. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I saw movement just beyond the tree line. A figure standing still, watching the cabin. I froze, heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the figure, but it vanished as soon as I pointed the beam. I called out, but no answer came, only the whisper of leaves. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak, every snap of a twig made me jump. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting by the wood stove, clutching my camera like a lifeline. On the fifth day, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed quickly, eager to leave the cabin behind. Before locking the door, I took a last look around. The strange marks were still there, and I felt a deep unease settle in my chest. As I drove away, the forest swallowed the cabin from sight. The quiet was back in the car, but I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure again. Weeks later, back home in Boston, I developed the photos I had taken. Most were beautiful shots of the forest and wildlife, but one picture made my skin crawl. In the blurry background of a tree line stood a person, face obscured by shadows, staring directly at the camera. I never showed that photo to anyone. I told myself it was just a coincidence, a hiker passing by, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. That week in the cabin had changed me, taught me that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but real people, and the unknown dangers lurking just beyond sight. I never planned to spend the weekend alone in the cabin. It wasn't like me to seek solitude, but after the long year I'd had, the break felt necessary. The cabin sat deep in the woods outside a small town called Milstone, nestled in the northern reaches of Vermont. The year was 2012, and I was 29 years old. I had rented the place for 3 days, craving the quiet and the chance to disconnect from the buzz of city life. The cabin was small, maybe 600 square feet, built from thick logs with a steep roof and a stone chimney. It sat on the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense trees that stretched up like fingers trying to catch the sky. The porch was weathered, paint peeling, but sturdy. The inside smelled of old pine and something faintly musty, like the scent of a place closed up for a long time. There was a wood stove in the corner of the living room, a small kitchen area with a sink, a tiny fridge, and a couple of shelves holding dusty canned goods and a few cooking utensils. I arrived late Friday afternoon, the sky already turning a soft gray. The drive had been long, the roads twisting and narrowing as I left the town behind. When I pulled up to the cabin, I noticed how quiet it was. No birdsong, no wind rustling through the leaves, just the heavy, thick silence of the woods. I brushed it off as normal for this time of year, early November, when the trees had lost most of their leaves and the air was cold enough to freeze the breath. I unpacked the car and carried my bags inside, setting them on the floor near the door. The first thing I did was light a fire in the stove, stacking the wood carefully and striking a match. The flames crackled to life, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I sat down on the old couch, a thin blanket draped over me, and took a deep breath. It felt good to be away from everything, away from the noise of work, the endless emails, the crowded streets. That night, I went to bed early. The cabin's single bedroom had a small window that looked out over the clearing. The darkness outside seemed to press against the glass, thick and solid. I lay under the blankets, listening to the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves, but otherwise the world was silent. Sleep came quickly. The next morning, I woke to pale light filtering through the curtains. The stove had burned low overnight, so I fed it more wood and boiled water on the old kettle for coffee. Outside, the forest was shrouded in mist, the trees standing like ghostly figures in the gray haze. I ate a simple breakfast, instant oatmeal and canned fruit, and then grabbed my hiking boots and jacket. I planned to spend the day exploring the woods, Maybe find a nearby stream I'd read about in the cabin guidebook. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my cheeks. The ground was soft and damp from overnight rain, and the smell of wet earth and pine filled the air. I followed a narrow path that twisted between trees, stepping over roots and fallen branches. The woods were alive with subtle sounds: the drip of water from leaves, the distant call of a crow, the soft rustle of small animals in the underbrush. After a few hours of walking, I came to the stream. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones with a steady, gentle sound. I knelt by the edge, cupping my hands to drink and splashing water on my face. It felt refreshing and real, like a small piece of the world untouched by anything artificial. As I wandered back toward the cabin, the sky grew darker. Thick clouds rolled in, heavy and low. By the time I reached the clearing, the first fat drops of rain were falling. I quickened my pace, the wind picking up and rattling the branches overhead. Inside the cabin, I closed the windows tight and stoked the fire again. The rain fell steadily now, drumming on the roof and splattering against the porch. I sat close to the stove, warming my hands, feeling a deep calm settle over me. The day had been exactly what I needed, a reminder of something simple and solid in the world. That evening, as darkness fell, I noticed something strange. Outside the cabin, just beyond the edge of the clearing, there was a faint glow. At first, I thought it was the moonlight, but the moon was hidden behind clouds. The light flickered, like a small fire or a lantern. I watched for a long time, but it never grew closer or moved away. It just stayed there, barely visible through the trees. I told myself it was probably a campfire from another camper or maybe a hunter's lantern, but no one had mentioned other people nearby, and the area was supposed to be empty at this time of year. Still, I tried not to think too much about it. The woods were full of stories and mysteries. Sometimes a light in the dark was just that, a light. I went to bed again, but sleep didn't come easy. The glow outside seemed to pull at my thoughts, a quiet presence in the blackness. I kept hearing noises, snaps, rustles, the soft crunch of footsteps on dead leaves. Every sound made me tense up, waiting for something that never came. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. On Sunday morning, the rain had stopped, and the sky was clear but cold. I decided to pack up and head back to town. I wasn't scared, at least not exactly, but I felt a strange unease I couldn't shake. Something about the cabin, the woods, the silence had unsettled me in a way I hadn't expected. I gathered my things and checked the cabin one last time. That's when I noticed it, a set of footprints in the mud outside the back door. They were fresh, the mud still soft and wet. The prints were too large to be mine and led away into the woods, disappearing among the trees. My heart pounded. I hadn't heard anyone come or go, but whoever had left the footprints had been close, closer than I'd wanted to imagine. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stay calm. There was no way to know if the person was dangerous or if they had simply been hiking nearby. But the idea that someone had been here while I slept made the cabin feel less safe. I grabbed my bag and hurried to the car. As I drove away, I looked back once. The cabin stood quiet in the clearing, the forest stretching endlessly behind it. The next day, back in town, I visited the local ranger station. I explained the footprints and the strange light I'd seen. The ranger listened carefully, then told me something that chilled me more than the dark woods ever had. The area had been used by illegal hunters and trespassers for years. Some had been caught, but many slipped away, hiding in the dense forest. The glow I'd seen was probably a lantern from one of them, and the footprints could belong to anyone passing through. He advised me to be careful if I ever returned, but I knew I wouldn't. That cabin, that weekend, had been a lesson in how close danger could be when you think you're alone. Looking back, I realized I was lucky. I never saw the person who left those prints. They never showed themselves, but the feeling of being watched, of not being truly alone in the woods, stayed with me for a long time after. It was a reminder that nature can be beautiful and peaceful, but it's also wild and unpredictable. And sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or legends, but real people, real threats hidden just beyond the trees. That's why I never went back to the cabin again. It was the fall of 1982 when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the forests of northern Maine. I was 28 at the time, working a dull job in a small town, needing a break from everything and everyone. The cabin belonged to my uncle, who had let it go unused for years. I had no cell phone, no internet, just the small gas lantern he left behind and a stack of books. The place was miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a rough dirt trail that wound through tall pine and birch trees. I remember driving my old rusty pickup as far as the truck could go before I had to walk the last 2 miles, dragging my gear behind me on a worn canvas duffel bag. The trail was narrow, littered with fallen branches and rocks, and it smelled of earth and damp leaves. The forest was quiet, but in a heavy kind of way. No birdsong, no rustling animals that I could hear at that moment. Only the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. When I finally saw the cabin, it sat nestled in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by towering trees. It was a small wooden structure, about 20 feet by 15, with faded green paint peeling off the sides and a rusty tin roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The porch had a couple of broken chairs, and the front door was solid oak, heavy and worn from years of weather. Inside, the cabin was dim but surprisingly clean. Dust covered the floorboards, and cobwebs clung to the corners, but the furniture was intact. There was a wood stove in the corner with a small stack of firewood beside it, a rickety table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed pushed up against the wall, and a tiny kitchen nook with a sink and a few cupboards. A small window faced the clearing, letting in weak sunlight filtered by the forest canopy. I unpacked slowly, making a small nest out of my sleeping bag on the bed and arranging my few supplies: canned food, water, matches, a knife, and the books I'd brought along. My plan was simple: stay off the grid, read, hike during the day, and relax. The first night was quiet except for the familiar crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest, branches creaking, the wind whispering through the trees. It was peaceful and felt safe, even though the isolation was thick in the air. The next morning, I woke early to a dull gray sky. The air was cold and crisp, smelling faintly of pine and wet soil. I dressed in layers, laced up my boots, and grabbed my old camera before heading out to explore the woods nearby. The trail was steeper than I remembered from my last visit, lined with moss-covered stones and tangled roots. I walked slowly, taking in the shapes of the trees, the patterns of light and shadow, and the subtle sounds around me. The distant rush of a stream, the flutter of wings as a crow took flight. I passed an old rusted gate that marked what must have been the boundary of a logging operation long ago. The ground was littered with broken branches and scattered leaves, and occasional tree stumps poked through the underbrush like ancient teeth. I paused to snap a few photos, feeling the familiar chill of solitude, but also a growing sense of unease I couldn't explain. The day passed quietly. I returned to the cabin as the sun began to dip below the treetops, lighting the sky in muted pink and orange. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and stirring the leaves outside. I made a fire and cooked a simple meal of beans and canned corn. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls closing in as darkness crept through the cracks. As I settled in for the night, I thought about how remote I was. No neighbors for miles, no passing cars on the trail, just me and the forest. The feeling was both comforting and strange. The third day, I decided to hike farther along the trail, hoping to find the small lake my uncle had mentioned once. The forest thickened, the trees growing closer together, their branches knitting overhead into a dense canopy that blocked much of the light. The trail was harder to follow now, fading into soft earth and thick roots. I stopped often to check my bearings, using a compass and the sun's position. After nearly 3 hours, I heard the faint sound of water. Breaking through the last of the trees, I found a small, glassy lake nestled in a hollow. The surface was still, reflecting the overcast sky like a mirror. The water was cold and dark, fringed with reeds and fallen branches. I sat on a mossy rock near the shore, watching the faint ripples where a fish must have broken the surface. I stayed there a while, listening to the wind rustling the reeds and the soft slap of water against the shore. It was beautiful and lonely all at once. On the way back, the sky had darkened, and a fine mist had begun to settle over the forest floor. The trail was slippery now, soaked with recent rain. I moved carefully, the damp air cold against my skin. Back at the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door, which I was sure I had locked tightly that morning, was slightly ajar. A small chill ran down my spine as I pushed it closed and checked the lock again. I told myself I must have been careless. That night, sleep was elusive. Every creak and groan of the cabin seemed amplified in the silence. The wind rattled the loose boards, and at one point, a branch tapped sharply against the window. I lay in the darkness, eyes wide open, heart pounding, feeling watched though I knew I was alone. The next day, I found more signs that unsettled me. The firewood pile near the stove had been disturbed. Some logs shifted as if someone had used them. My supplies seemed untouched, but the feeling of intrusion lingered. The forest outside seemed darker, more oppressive. I stayed mostly inside, reading and trying to focus on the peaceful quiet. But at dusk, as I stacked firewood on the porch, I saw footprints in the soft earth near the cabin. Heavy boots, larger than mine, pressed into the mud leading away toward the trees. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. I was alone here, miles from any road, and someone else had been close enough to leave tracks. I scanned the tree line, but the fading light made it impossible to see far. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the fire, clutching my knife and listening for any sound outside. Hours passed. At one point, I heard the faint crunch of footsteps around the perimeter of the clearing. They stopped and started again, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, heart hammering. When dawn finally came, the forest was quiet again. The footprints were gone, washed away by rain overnight. But I knew someone had been here. For the next 2 days, I was on edge. I kept the fire burning day and night and stayed close to the cabin, peering into the woods whenever I could. I heard distant noises, branches breaking, twigs snapping, but never saw anyone. On the 4th day, I found a shallow hole dug near the back of the cabin, hidden under some leaves. It was fresh, the dirt still loose and damp. Something was buried there or had been recently disturbed. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone had hidden something or was watching me. I gathered my courage and looked around the clearing more carefully. Near a pile of old logs, I spotted a rusted canteen and a small folded piece of paper. The paper was soaked and torn, but I managed to unfold it, revealing a crudely drawn map of the area around the cabin with an X marked not far from the site. My heart pounded as I stared at it. Someone had been here, scouting or hiding something valuable. The thought of being so close to an unknown person filled me with a mix of fear and curiosity. That evening, I prepared myself to investigate the spot marked on the map. I took a flashlight, my knife, and a small crowbar from the cabin's kitchen, ready to uncover whatever lay buried. The forest was dark and silent as I moved through the trees, the beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow path ahead. I reached the X quickly, an area covered in leaves and moss. Using the crowbar, I began to dig at the spot, scraping away dirt and roots. After several minutes, the metal blade hit something hard. Heart racing, I dug more carefully until I uncovered a small metal box, old and rusted but intact. I pried it open and found a handful of faded photographs, a leather-bound notebook, and a small bundle of bills wrapped in rubber bands. The photographs showed an old man and a young woman at the cabin, smiling and relaxed. The notebook was filled with handwriting, notes about the cabin, sketches of the surrounding area, and a journal of the man's thoughts. The bills were American dollars, but from decades ago. I read through the journal that night by the firelight, piecing together the story of a man who had lived here long ago with his daughter. He wrote about hiding money away during hard times, fearful that someone might come looking for it. The last entries hinted at trouble. Men coming into the forest, threatening him, forcing him to bury the money and disappear. The story made me understand why someone might still come back, searching for that hidden stash. It was a dangerous reminder that the forest was not as empty as I had hoped. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed everything carefully, including the box and the notebook. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to take a week off from my life in Columbus, Ohio, and head out to the remote woods of northern Michigan. I was 27 then, tired of the noise of the city, the endless hum of traffic, and the constant chatter of people. I wanted silence, just silence and the deep, cold forest around a cabin I had found in a small classified ad in a local newspaper. The ad described a modest, old cabin on the edge of Huron National Forest, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, Gaylord. It was small but sturdy, with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a porch that looked out on a clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I figured it was just because of how far it was from anything. No internet, no cell service, no electricity except what the wood stove could generate in heat. I packed my old Jeep with supplies, canned food, water, a few books, my camping gear, and enough clothes to last me a week. The drive was long but peaceful. The trees stretched on for miles, and as I got closer, the air smelled fresher, wetter, and colder. I hadn't been camping or even close to nature for a long time. The plan was simple: spend a week alone in the cabin, read, write in my journal, and just be away from everything. The day I arrived was clear but chilly, around mid-October. The leaves had already turned, splashes of orange, red, and yellow everywhere. The gravel road leading to the cabin was rough, and the last mile had me creeping along slowly to avoid kicking up dust or rocks. When I finally saw the cabin, it was exactly like the pictures. Weathered wood walls, a rusty metal roof, and a porch with a few broken chairs. The first thing I did was open the windows to let fresh air in and check everything inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and something faintly musty. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, and cobwebs hung in the corners. It hadn't been used for a while. The furniture was sparse: a sagging couch, a small wooden table, and a bed with a mattress that looked thin but clean enough. The wood stove sat cold in the corner of the living room, and I had a box of matches with me to get it going. I unpacked slowly, enjoying the quiet that was almost holy after the noise of the city. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows between the trees. I made a fire in the stove, heating up the cabin, and warmed some canned soup for dinner. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves and branches, making the old cabin creak softly. It was peaceful but somehow strange, like the forest was watching me. That night, I slept with the windows cracked open. The sounds of the forest were unfamiliar at first: the snapping of twigs, the rustling of small animals, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. I had brought a small flashlight and kept it by my bed. The next few days passed in a slow rhythm. I read old paperbacks, took long walks on the trails that started just past the clearing, and jotted down my thoughts in my journal. The forest was beautiful, but it had a harshness to it too: sharp rocks, uneven ground, and thick underbrush that caught at my clothes. I kept finding signs of deer and other animals, but I didn't see many. The sky was often gray, and cold rain came a few times, making the woods smell even stronger inside. One afternoon, on my third day there, I went deeper into the woods. I followed a narrow path that wound through tall pines, moss-covered rocks, and fallen logs. The air was damp, and everything was quiet except for the crunch of my boots on dead leaves. I stopped at a small creek to drink from my water bottle and rest. The sun peeked out briefly, turning the water a bright blue under the shadow of the trees. On my way back, I noticed something strange. On the ground near a thick oak, there were fresh footprints, large, booted prints, not animal tracks. They were too big to be mine and looked like someone else had passed by recently. My heart beat faster. I had expected to be alone, but maybe someone else was out here. Hunters, hikers, or maybe a local camper. I didn't see anyone, but the thought made me uneasy. I walked faster back to the cabin, the forest feeling heavier, the shadows longer. When I got inside, I locked the door and checked all the windows. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, like it was closing in on me. I tried to shake the feeling and went to bed early. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises outside, Footsteps on the gravel, faint knocks on the wooden walls, branches scraping against the windows. Every time I peered outside with my flashlight, there was nothing there but empty woods and dark shapes. I told myself it was just animals or the wind playing tricks. On the fourth day, the weather turned worse. Heavy rain and wind shook the cabin. I stayed inside, lighting the stove to keep warm. The rain made the forest outside look gray and blurry, and the dirt paths turned into mud. I spent the day reading and trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was off. Around evening, the power went out. Not that I had any electric power to begin with, but my little battery-powered radio also stopped working. I had brought a small solar charger, but the rain meant no sun, so my phone was dead too. I was completely cut off. Then I heard it, a loud banging on the cabin door. I froze. My hands trembled as I grabbed the flashlight. The banging came again, harder this time. Someone was outside. I wanted to call out, ask who it was, but my voice stuck in my throat. I couldn't see anyone through the small window next to the door. The rain and dark hid everything. I grabbed my hunting knife from the kitchen counter and sat down on the couch, trying to stay calm. The banging stopped after a minute. The silence returned, but now it felt heavy, like the air was thick and waiting. After what felt like hours, I slowly crept to the door and peeked out again. Nothing. No footprints, no sign anyone had been there. The mud outside was still untouched. It was as if the knocking had been a trick of my mind or maybe an animal hitting the door with a stick. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind or my nerves. But I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, the forest looked calmer, but my unease hadn't faded. I stayed near the cabin all day, keeping my knife close and double-checking every window and lock. I noticed that some of the footprints I had seen earlier were now closer to the cabin. Fresh tracks circled the clearing like someone had been watching me. I realized I wasn't just scared of the dark woods anymore. Someone had been here near the cabin and I didn't know why. The thought that I could be alone with someone unknown hiding nearby made me anxious. On the fifth day, I made a decision. I needed to leave. I packed my things quickly, cleaned up the cabin, and got into my Jeep. The rain had stopped, and the sky was clearing. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine wouldn't start. I tried again and again. Nothing. Panic set in. I got out and checked under the hood. Everything looked normal, but I had no tools, no way to fix it. The forest was silent except for the wind through the trees. I looked around, hoping to see a passing car or a hiker. Nothing. Then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible between two trees. It was a man, tall, wearing a dark jacket and a hat. He didn't move. He just watched me. I felt my throat tighten. I grabbed my knife and yelled, though I knew no one was nearby to hear me. The man didn't flinch. Slowly, he stepped out from behind the tree and started walking toward me. I slammed the Jeep door shut and locked it. My heart pounded so loud I thought it would burst. The man reached the car, tapped the window with his knuckles, and stared inside. I didn't know what he wanted. I wanted to run, but the Jeep wouldn't start. I grabbed my phone, hoping for a signal. Nothing. The man tapped the window again, then pointed toward the woods and back down the road. He seemed calm, almost like he was warning me. I took a deep breath and unlocked the door, stepping out slowly. He nodded and said nothing. I decided to follow him. He led me down the road, his step steady and sure. After a few minutes, we reached a small ranger station. The man knocked and opened the door for me. Inside, a radio crackled. They told me a mechanic was coming to fix my Jeep. The man was a local ranger, checking the area for hunters and making sure no one got lost. Relief washed over me. I had imagined the worst. The footprints, the knocking, the figure, all real but not dangerous. Just a reminder that the woods were wild, and sometimes you felt alone because you didn't know what was around the next bend. The mechanic arrived an hour later, fixed the Jeep, and I drove away slowly, the forest fading behind me. I never went back to that cabin. The silence I wanted was never really quiet, but I learned something important. Fear can grow from what we don't understand, but the truth is often simpler. The forest isn't haunted. It's just wild, and sometimes it's better to respect that and stay safe. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to spend a week alone at a small cabin tucked away in the dense woods of northern Vermont. I was 28 years old, recently burned out from city life and work, craving silence and the chance to clear my head. The cabin belonged to my uncle's old friend who had passed away a few years before. He had left the place to my uncle, who wasn't interested in it, so he gave me the keys. I was excited but also a little nervous, since the cabin was deep in the forest, far from any main roads or neighbors. The drive up was long but peaceful. As I approached the dirt road leading to the cabin, I saw tall pine trees on both sides, their needles sharp and bright against the late October sky. The air smelled crisp and earthy. When I finally pulled up to the small clearing where the cabin sat, I was struck by how quiet everything was. No sounds of cars, no distant voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft wind through the trees. The cabin itself was simple, built mostly from rough timber and stone. It looked sturdy, but weathered. The windows were dusty, and a few of the wooden planks on the porch were cracked. I opened the door and was hit with the musty smell of wood and old furniture. The inside was small but cozy. There was a wood stove in the corner, a kitchen area with a small sink and a rusty gas stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a couch covered in faded fabric. Upstairs was a tiny loft with a bed and a small dresser. The whole place was dim, with shadows clinging to the corners, but the soft golden light from the few lamps gave it a warm feeling. I spent the first day unpacking, cleaning up the cabin, and gathering firewood from the stack outside. I made a fire in the stove and cooked some simple food, canned soup and bread, and felt a deep sense of relief as the warmth spread through the room. The quiet was strange at first, but I found it soothing. Without internet, phone service, or television, I was forced to be alone with my thoughts, which was something I hadn't done in a long time. That night, after eating and reading a book by the firelight, I went outside to get some fresh air. The moon was bright and full, casting silver light over the forest. I noticed how the trees moved slowly with the breeze, casting long, twisting shadows on the ground. The stars were countless, twinkling above the treetops. I breathed deeply, feeling the cold air fill my lungs. Everything was still except for the faint sounds of insects and the soft snap of a twig somewhere far off. I went back inside and prepared for bed. The loft was small and a little uncomfortable, but the thick quilt kept me warm. I lay there listening to the creaking of the cabin settling, the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt peaceful. The next few days passed quietly. I kept busy by chopping more firewood, hiking through the woods, and fishing in the small stream about a half-mile from the cabin. I found an old journal left by the previous owner on a dusty shelf in the cabin. The pages were yellowed and filled with neat handwriting. It told stories of his life here, hunting, fishing, surviving harsh winters alone. Reading it made the cabin feel less lonely, like someone had lived and breathed there before me. One afternoon, as I was walking back from the stream, I noticed something odd. The path I had taken wasn't as clear as before. Some branches were broken and lying across the trail, and the ground looked disturbed, like something large had passed through recently. I paused, looking deeper into the trees. There was no movement, but a feeling settled in my chest, something like unease. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a bear passing through. The woods were wild, after all. That evening, I stayed close to the cabin. I double-checked the doors and windows, locked the small metal latch on the door, and piled wood near the stove. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and making the trees groan. I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, listening to the wind howl outside. The cozy warmth inside was comforting, but the forest beyond felt dark and unknown. On the 4th day, something strange happened. I was cooking dinner when I heard a sudden noise outside, something heavy moving quickly through the brush. I froze, setting down the pan. The noise stopped abruptly. I listened hard. The silence pressed in. No birds, no wind, just a heavy, tense stillness. I didn't see anything when I looked out the window, but I noticed fresh footprints in the mud near the porch. They were big and uneven, not like any animal I knew. They led into the woods but didn't come back. My heart beat faster, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I checked the locks again and made sure the windows were shut tight. That night was the hardest. Every little sound felt amplified. Branches snapping, the wind blowing, the distant calls of animals all seemed threatening. I barely slept, sitting with the fire burning low, ready to wake at any moment. I kept glancing toward the door, feeling like something was just outside, watching. The next morning, I found more signs. Broken branches near the cabin, some scraped bark on the trees, and a piece of torn fabric caught on a low branch near the back porch. It looked like something had brushed past in a hurry. I checked my supplies, making sure I had enough food and water if I needed to stay inside for longer. Despite the fear, I was determined not to panic. I knew I had to stay calm and rational. I told myself that whoever or whatever was out there probably wasn't trying to hurt me. Maybe someone was hunting illegally or just passing through. But the thought didn't bring much comfort. As the day went on, I stayed inside, keeping the stove going and the doors locked. When evening came, I prepared to spend another long night awake. I moved the heavy metal poker from the fireplace to my side of the couch, just in case. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the wooden frame. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a sudden loud banging on the door. My heart jumped out of my chest. I grabbed the poker and crept over to the door, pressing my ear against it. There was heavy breathing on the other side, followed by silence. Then, slowly, the banging came again. 3 hard knocks like a warning. I backed away, feeling trapped and scared. I tried to steady my breathing and decided to call the local ranger station on the cabin's old landline phone. The line was dead. No signal anywhere. The forest was isolating me completely. Hours passed. I kept the fire alive, sitting in the dark with only the flickering light around me. I didn't hear the knocking again, but I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow and careful, like someone was trying to decide what to do next. As dawn broke, the noises stopped. I waited until full light before venturing outside. The forest was calm again, but the evidence was all around. Deep footprints circled the cabin, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. I followed them into the woods as far as I dared. They vanished near a thicket, as if the person or animal had disappeared into the dense brush. I spent the next day packing. I was done being scared and alone. I cleaned the cabin as best as I could and locked the door behind me. I stuck a note inside the window. To whoever finds this, someone was here. Be careful. The hike back to my car was tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the forest was silent, no sign of movement. When I finally got to the main road and drove away, I felt a rush of relief that I hadn't felt in days. The experience had shaken me deeply, but it had also taught me something important about solitude and survival. Looking back, I don't know for sure who or what was lurking in those woods. Maybe it was just a lost hunter or someone camping nearby. Maybe something else. But whatever it wasn't friendly, and it had reminded me how alone and vulnerable you can be in the wilderness. The cabin stayed empty after that. I never went back. The silence I sought had been replaced by a fear I couldn't shake. But even with that fear, I learned to respect the wild, to pay attention to every sound and shadow, and to trust my instincts. That week changed me. It made me realize that sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but the real threats that live quietly in the dark places of the world. People, nature, and the unknown. And sometimes the best endings are simply getting away alive, carrying the memories as warnings, and choosing to live with more caution and awareness. It was the summer of 2007 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I was 28 then, and after a brutal year working in a demanding office job in Minneapolis, I desperately needed to get away from the noise and the crowds. The city's constant hum was suffocating, and I had long dreamed of escaping to a place where the only sounds were the wind through the pines and the crackling of a fire. So I rented a modest cabin on the shores of a remote lake about a 3-hour drive north, near the small town of Ely. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 1950s, but it was sturdy and functional. It sat on a small clearing surrounded by thick forest on three sides and faced the lake. The porch creaked underfoot, and the wooden siding was weathered by decades of wind, rain, and snow. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen area, a stone fireplace, and a narrow staircase leading to a tiny loft where the bed was tucked away under the eaves. There was no electricity except for a small solar panel hooked to a few basic lights and a phone line that only worked sporadically. I brought along a small generator for emergencies, along with plenty of food, water, and camping supplies. The first day was peaceful. I arrived in the afternoon, unpacked my things, and wandered down to the lake's edge. The water was cool and clear, reflecting the towering pines that bordered the shore. No one else was around for miles. The only sounds were the occasional call of a loon and the gentle lap of waves against the rocky beach. I spent the evening building a fire outside, cooking canned stew over the flames, and watching the stars emerge overhead. The isolation felt like a balm, washing away months of stress. The next few days were uneventful, filled with routine. Long hikes along narrow trails, reading old books I had brought, fishing in the lake, and tending the fire. I had brought a small radio, but the signal was weak, mostly just static or distant voices I couldn't quite make out. Sometimes I felt a strange sense of unease, a vague awareness that the forest was watching me. But I shrugged it off as the natural nervousness anyone might feel when alone in the wilderness. On the fourth night, everything changed. I had spent the day hiking a trail that followed the lake's eastern shore. It was late afternoon when I returned, tired and dirty, with a small haul of fish. I cleaned up, prepared dinner, and settled into my chair by the fire, feeling the warmth seep into my bones as the sun slipped below the horizon. The sky was streaked with pink and orange, and the forest darkened quickly. As the night grew deeper, I noticed something strange. A set of faint, distant noises at first, just rustling in the underbrush far beyond the cabin's clearing. At first, I thought it was just animals, deer or maybe raccoons. But then I heard something else, something more deliberate, the sound of footsteps. Soft, slow steps on the dry leaves and twigs that littered the forest floor. I sat still, listening intently, but the noise faded into silence. I told myself it was nothing, probably a hiker or another camper nearby. But when I glanced around the perimeter of the clearing, I noticed the shadows seemed thicker, almost unnatural. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine needles. Around 10 p.m., the noises returned, this time closer and more distinct. Footsteps, slow and heavy, accompanied by the occasional crack of a branch. They circled the clearing. I could see nothing, but the sound moved from one side to the other, as if someone or something was pacing just beyond the trees. My heart rate increased, but I forced myself to remain calm. I checked my phone, no signal. The generator was off and I didn't want to use it yet. I had a small hunting knife in my backpack, which I retrieved and kept by my side, though I hoped I wouldn't need it. Suddenly, I heard a loud snap right outside the porch. I froze, gripping the knife tightly. Then came slow, deliberate footsteps up the wooden stairs onto the porch. I could not see anyone, but the weight of their presence was heavy. The floorboards creaked under their steps. The moon was nearly full, casting pale light that barely pierced the thick canopy. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the darkness. I wanted to shout, to demand whoever was there to leave, but my voice caught in my throat. The fear was raw and paralyzing. Then, without warning, the footsteps retreated. They moved back through the forest, fading as quickly as they had come. For the next hour, I sat awake, watching the shadows, waiting for another sign of the intruder. But the forest returned to silence. The next morning, I found broken branches and footprints in the soft dirt around the cabin. The prints were large, not human. They were irregular, almost like a heavy animal's paws, but the spacing was odd. I compared them to my own boots and the local wildlife prints I had seen earlier. They did not match any animal I knew. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I moved heavy furniture near the door, tighten the locks, and set up a makeshift alarm with cans tied to strings around the perimeter. Still, the feeling of being watched did not go away. The forest seemed alive with unseen eyes. On the fifth night, the noises returned, louder and more persistent. This time, there were multiple sets of footsteps, circling and pacing. The rustling grew closer to the windows, and faint tapping came against the wooden walls. My nerves frayed with every passing minute. In a desperate effort to defend myself, I took out a small flare gun I had brought for emergencies and kept it loaded nearby. I waited, muscles tense, ready to fire at the slightest sign of threat. Suddenly, a figure appeared outside the window. Not a ghost or monster, but a man. He was thin, dressed in dark clothes, and his face was partially hidden by a hood. His eyes glinted with something cold and unsettling. He stared in, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. Then he raised a hand and tapped the window twice before disappearing back into the woods. I did not sleep that night. When morning came, I packed everything quickly. I was shaken and exhausted, but I knew I had to leave. I locked the cabin door behind me and started down the narrow dirt road that led back to the highway. As I walked, I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see the man following me, but the forest remained quiet. I reached the highway late that afternoon and finally caught a ride back to civilization. In the following days, I called the local sheriff's office and reported what I had seen. They told me the area was known for occasional trespassers, people living off the grid, poachers, or squatters. There had been past incidents of theft and intimidation, but nothing violent. I realized then that what I had experienced was not supernatural, but a very real human threat. The wilderness was beautiful and peaceful, but it was also home to people who did not want outsiders wandering into their territory. Though I never returned to that cabin, I kept in touch with the locals, who reassured me the intruder was eventually caught. He had been living illegally in the forest, preying on campers and hikers. The sheriff's office increased patrols, and the cabin owner installed new security measures. The whole experience changed me. I learned to respect the woods not just for their beauty, but for their hidden dangers. Being alone out there meant relying on my own instincts, staying alert, and never underestimating the people who might be watching from the shadows. Looking back now, almost 15 years later, I'm glad I got out safely. That trip was supposed to be a quiet escape, a chance to find peace in nature. Instead, it became a lesson in vigilance and survival. I never saw the man again, but his presence lingered in my memory, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't predict, and the real dangers are the ones that walk on two legs. I still cherish the memories of the lake, the stars, and the solitude, but I also carry the knowledge that even in the wildest places, you're never truly alone. I had never been much of a nature person, but sometimes life pushes you into places you never expected. It was the spring of 1998, and I was 27 years old. I had been working long hours in a small publishing office in Portland, Oregon. The city was loud, crowded, and draining. I was tired, more than tired. I was drained to the bone. So, when my uncle offered me the chance to spend a week in his cabin deep in the Willamette National Forest, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was small and isolated, far from any roads or other cabins, built on the edge of a thick forest that stretched for miles. I knew I'd have no phone, no internet, no distractions, just the woods and me. The drive out was long. I rented a beat-up old pickup truck, packed some basics, and drove as far as I could on paved roads before switching to gravel and dirt. After a few hours of driving, the trees closed in on the narrow dirt path, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. The sunlight filtered through the leaves and patches, casting moving shadows on the dusty ground. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip behind the hills. The cabin was rough, with weathered wooden planks and a stone chimney on the side. It looked like something straight out of a hunting magazine. Exactly what I needed. I unlocked the door with the key my uncle had left, and the smell of old pine and dry wood hit me immediately. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No cars, no voices, not even birds. Just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A small wood stove sat in the corner, surrounded by mismatched chairs and a rickety table. There was a single bedroom with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, and a tiny bathroom with a cold water tap and a grimy mirror. I set my bag down and lit a fire in the stove, feeling the warmth spread through the room. The first night was peaceful. I ate some canned soup, drank a bottle of water, and listened to the crackling fire. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. The distant hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets, the occasional snap of a twig. I didn't feel scared. I felt calm. The next morning, I woke up early. The cabin was bathed in soft morning light, and the air smelled fresh and damp. I made coffee on the stove and stepped outside to breathe in the cool air. The forest was dense, full of tall firs and maples, and the ground was covered in moss and fallen leaves. I decided to explore a little, staying close to the cabin so I wouldn't get lost. I found a narrow trail that wound through the trees, barely wide enough for one person. The sounds of the forest were louder here, the rustle of squirrels in the bushes, the distant gurgle of a stream, the buzz of flies. I walked for maybe an hour, enjoying the quiet, until I came to a small clearing with a shallow pond. The water was still and clear, reflecting the sky and trees like glass. I sat on a fallen log and watched for a while, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. As the day went on, I did some basic chores around the cabin, stacking firewood, cleaning the stove, checking the water supply. My uncle had left a small generator and a solar panel, so I had just enough power to charge my phone and a small lantern. I didn't use the phone much. Part of me wanted to escape the noise and demands of everyday life. On the second night, something started to change. I was sitting by the fire when I heard it. A faint noise outside, like someone walking on dry leaves. I paused, listening carefully. The wind had died down, but I could still hear the soft crunch of footsteps around the cabin. I stood up and looked out the window, but all I saw was darkness and trees. No sign of anyone. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, just moving through the underbrush, but the feeling of being watched settled in my chest, and it didn't go away. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, then sat back down, trying to focus on the fire. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day was overcast, the sky thick with gray clouds. I didn't feel like exploring, so I stayed inside, reading a worn paperback my uncle had left on the shelf. Every now and then, I glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees. But there was nothing, just the forest, endless and silent. That night, the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, closer. I heard them circling the cabin, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was pounding. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the stove and waited, staring out into the blackness. Hours passed. The noise stopped. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin. Maybe this wasn't a good idea after all. I packed up my things, got into the truck, and started the slow drive back. But as I pulled out onto the dirt road, the truck sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. The engine was dead. I climbed out and checked under the hood, but I didn't know much about cars. It looked fine on the surface, but I couldn't get it started. I was stuck. I walked back to the cabin, hoping my uncle might have left some tools or a spare tire. Inside, I found a small toolbox with some wrenches and screwdrivers, but no extra parts. The generator was dead too. It hadn't been charged in months. That night, the footsteps came again. I was too tired and scared to fight it anymore. I huddled under a thick blanket, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The footsteps paced around the cabin, slower now, almost curious. I heard breathing, soft and uneven, coming from the woods. Suddenly, something banged against the side of the cabin. A hard, heavy thud that shook the wooden walls. I froze, too scared to move. Then again, and again, heavy knocks like someone trying to break in. I remembered the old hunting rifle my uncle had left in the corner. I grabbed it and loaded it as best I could. I wasn't a hunter, never shot a gun in my life, but it gave me some comfort. The knocking stopped. The forest was silent again, except for my ragged breathing. I waited, hour after hour, until the first light of dawn. When morning came, I crept outside. The ground was soft and wet with dew, and I looked for tracks near the cabin. There were footprints in the mud, heavy boots, too big for me, circling the cabin and leading back into the trees. I followed the tracks for a short distance. They disappeared where the forest grew thicker. I didn't want to go deeper. I wanted to get away. Back at the cabin, I packed what I could carry and prepared to leave on foot. The truck was dead, and I had no signal on my phone. I figured the nearest ranger station was about 8 miles away. I took my pack, the rifle, and enough food and water for 2 days, then set off through the forest. Walking through the trees was slow and exhausting. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks, and the dense canopy blocked much of the light. I kept checking behind me, feeling like something was following. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart jump. By nightfall, I reached a small creek and made camp. I built a fire, cooked some food, and tried to rest. The forest was alive with sounds, but the footsteps were gone. For the first time since I arrived, I felt safe. The next day, I kept walking, pushing myself through the underbrush. Around midday, I finally saw signs of civilization. A worn trail, old markers nailed to trees. I followed the trail until it opened onto a dirt road. I walked until I saw a truck parked by the side, with 2 men standing nearby. They looked surprised to see me, and I explained my situation without words, showing my empty gas can and pointing back toward the cabin. They offered me a ride and called the local ranger station. Soon, I was sitting in a warm truck, heading back to town. I told them everything: the footsteps, the knocks, the truck breaking down, the footprints in the mud. The rangers agreed to check the cabin. A few days later, I learned they found signs that someone had been living in the forest nearby, an illegal squatter who had been hiding out in a makeshift camp just a mile from the cabin. The man had a history of violence and was known to sneak around, stealing supplies and scaring off anyone who came close. The rangers arrested him before he could do any real harm. Looking back, I'm glad I left the cabin when I did. The experience taught me how real fear can be, how the unknown is terrifying even without ghosts or monsters. It wasn't the forest itself that scared me, but the presence of someone else, someone with unknown intentions and no regard for my safety. Now, years later, I still think about that week. The quiet, the isolation, the feeling of being watched. I never went back, but I carry the memory with me. A reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't see clearly, the ones hiding just beyond the trees, waiting. It was the summer of 1997 when I decided to spend a week alone at a cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I was 28 years old then, a bit tired of the city noise and constant demands of my office job. The city had a way of wearing me down. Its noise, the rush, the endless flood of people always rushing somewhere. I wanted to escape. I wanted to find silence, peace, and some time to think. So I rented a small cabin a few miles from the nearest town, a place I had only seen in pictures before, tucked away in a thick forest by a small lake. No cell phone signal, no internet, no distractions. The cabin was owned by a quiet old man named Mr. Harrow, who lived in the nearest town of Maplewood. When I picked up the key, he warned me to be careful in the woods and said the forest around there could feel strange to some. I didn't think much of it. Strange forests were normal to me. I liked the quiet, the stillness, the smell of pine and wet earth. The cabin itself was old, built in the early 1950s, made of weathered logs and with a stone chimney. It had no electricity, just a wood stove for heat and an old lantern for light. There was a small kitchen, a bedroom with a narrow bed, and a tiny bathroom with a well for water. The lake was just a short walk away, perfect for fishing or swimming. The first few days passed slowly but peacefully. I chopped wood, cooked simple meals, and spent hours sitting on the porch watching the sun move through the trees. I read some books I brought along and wrote in a notebook. The forest was alive with sounds. Birdsong, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. At night, the sky was so dark and full of stars that it felt like the whole universe was watching over me. I liked that feeling. It made me feel small, yes, but also calm and connected. But then, on the third night, something changed. I had gone to bed early because I was tired from chopping wood that afternoon. I remember lying there in the dark, listening to the sounds outside. Then, around midnight, I heard it, a noise coming from the woods. At first, it was faint, like a slow scraping or dragging sound, soft but distinct. I froze and tried to tell myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound didn't stop, came closer, then paused, then moved again. It was irregular, not like an animal's quiet step or rustle. It was heavier, more deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, my heart pounding. I wanted to get up and check, but the cabin felt so small and vulnerable, and outside the darkness was thick and deep. The only light was the faint moonlight through the window, casting shadows on the walls. After a while, the noise stopped, but I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing little sounds, twigs breaking, leaves crunching, soft footsteps. Nothing close enough to see, but close enough to make my skin crawl. The next day, I walked down to the lake to clear my head. The air was fresh, cool, and the water was calm and clear. I tried to think rationally. Maybe a hunter or another camper had come near the cabin. But I hadn't seen any other people on the trail. The only footprints near the cabin were mine. That evening, I decided to secure the cabin better. I locked the doors and windows, stacked more wood by the door, and kept my old hunting knife close on the kitchen table. I tried to remind myself that I was probably overreacting. The forest was full of wildlife. It was normal to hear strange noises. The fourth day was the worst. Around late afternoon, while I was chopping more wood near the back of the cabin, I noticed something strange on the ground. A set of footprints, large, heavy, and not like any animals. They were human. They led from the tree line right up to the back door of the cabin and then stopped. I checked the door. It was locked, but I found a scratch mark on the wood frame, like someone had tried to pry it open. My chest tightened. I wasn't alone. I searched the area carefully. There were no other signs, no dropped items, no voices, no fire. Whoever had come this close hadn't left much evidence except those prints and the scratch. I didn't want to spend another night feeling so unsafe, so I made a plan. I gathered all the extra wood and stacked it around the windows and doors, then closed the shutters. I moved the lantern into the bedroom so I could keep an eye on the windows from the bed. I ate quickly and then sat with my knife on the porch for an hour, watching the tree line, waiting. Nothing happened. The night was long and tense. Every noise made me jump. I felt trapped in the small cabin with the dark woods pressing in on every side. I tried to focus on breathing and calming down, but my mind kept replaying the footprints and the scratch marks. On the fifth day, I decided to explore the woods during daylight to see if I could find any clues about who had been near my cabin. I took a backpack with water, a map, some snacks, and my knife, then set off on a trail that led deeper into the forest. The trees grew thick and tall. The air smelled of damp moss and pine needles. The sun filtered through the leaves in golden rays. I walked for hours, noticing broken branches and small clearings. But I didn't see any signs of people, no trash, no fire pits, no tents. Just the occasional animal tracks and bird calls. As I made my way back toward the cabin, I heard a faint sound, something mechanical, like a low engine. I paused and listened. It was coming from the direction of the road, maybe a mile away. I thought it might be a car or a tractor. It was a relief to hear some sign of civilization, even if distant. That night, I kept the doors locked and the lantern lit. But when I went outside to check the woodpile, I noticed something else. A scrap of cloth caught on a branch near the cabin's back door. Dark green, like the jacket I had seen hanging on the coat rack of the cabin when I arrived. But this was torn, dirty, and soaked with moisture. Someone had been here very recently. I didn't want to panic, but my instincts told me to leave the next day. On the sixth day, I packed most of my things. I planned to leave early the following morning. But that night, something happened that finally pushed me over the edge. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps just outside the cabin. They were slow, deliberate, and circling the building. I could hear the soft scrape of boots against gravel and the occasional sharp snap of a twig. The footsteps paused on the porch. My heart felt like it would burst. I was frozen, gripping the knife under my pillow. Then came the sound of the door handle rattling. My mind raced. The cabin door was locked, but whoever was outside was trying hard to get in. The rattling stopped and footsteps moved away, then circled around again, closer this time. The footsteps dragged slightly, like the person was tired or carrying something heavy. I stayed still until the noises faded into the night. When dawn finally came, I barely slept. I felt weak and exhausted but knew I had to get out. I packed the last of my things quietly. Before leaving, I checked the cabin carefully, every window, every door. Nothing else seemed disturbed except the back door, which now had deeper scratches and a few fresh marks as if someone had tried to pry it open again. I took my backpack and walked briskly to the road, keeping my eyes on the trees behind me. The woods seemed quieter than usual, but I didn't dare stop or look back. After about a mile, I reached the edge of the forest and saw a small dirt road. A few cars passed by slowly. I flagged one down, explained I had been camping and wanted to get to Maplewood. The driver was kind and gave me a ride to town. In Maplewood, I reported the incident to the local sheriff. He took my statement and said there had been reports of someone living illegally in the woods, an older man who refused to leave and sometimes frightened hikers and campers. They had been trying to catch him for months. The sheriff promised to check the cabin and the surrounding area. I never went back to that cabin. The forest, which once felt peaceful, now felt cold and threatening in my memory. I still think about those footsteps and the person who tried to break in. I realize now how vulnerable I was out there, alone. But I also learned to trust my instincts and respect the power of silence and isolation. Sometimes being alone is not just peaceful, it can be dangerous. And in the quiet woods, sometimes the real fear comes from people, not the shadows. It was the fall of 1993 when I decided to escape the noise of the city for a week. I was 28 at the time, and the endless routine of work and crowded streets was eating at me. I wanted silence, fresh air, and a break from everything. So, I rented a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont, a place I'd never been before. The owner's ad promised seclusion, a simple cabin with no electricity, just with heat and fresh spring water nearby. Perfect, I thought. No distractions, just me and the forest. I drove up a winding, narrow road that cut through dense pine and maple trees, their leaves just beginning to turn gold and red. The air grew cooler and crisper as I got closer, the smell of wet earth and pine needles filling the car. I passed a few houses scattered far apart, mostly hidden behind thick woods. The further I went, the quieter it got. Eventually, the road turned to gravel and then dirt, rough and bumpy. I was sure my small car wasn't meant for this kind of trip, but I kept going. The cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. It looked older than I expected, with dark weathered wood and a rusty metal roof. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and a pile of firewood leaned against the wall. A narrow path led downhill through the trees to a small stream. The place was silent except for the soft rustling of leaves and occasional bird calls. Felt remote, exactly what I wanted. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A wood stove sat in the corner with a few logs stacked nearby. A single window looked out onto the forest, its glass a little dusty but clear enough. There was a small table with 2 chairs, a worn-out couch, and a basic bed with an old quilt. No phone, no electricity, just a lantern hanging from a hook near the door. I set down my bags, opened the window to let the cool air in, and started to settle. The first day was peaceful. I explored the nearby woods, walking slowly along the path to the stream. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I filled a bottle with fresh spring water and sat on a fallen log, watching a squirrel dart through the trees. The forest was alive with small sounds, the rustle of leaves, The buzz of insects, distant bird calls, but no humans. Felt good to be alone. At night, I built a fire in the stove, its warmth filling the cabin. Outside, the sky was clear and full of stars. The quiet was deep, almost thick. It was a good kind of silence. The second day, I went further into the woods. I had a small backpack with some food, water, and a map the owner had left. I followed a faint trail that climbed up a ridge. The trees grew denser, and the ground was covered with moss and fallen leaves. After a couple of hours, I reached a clearing with a view of the valley below. The colors of the trees stretched out in every direction: orange, yellow, red, and green. The air smelled damp and fresh. I sat on a rock, took out a sandwich, and ate slowly, enjoying the quiet. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was low in the sky. I gathered more firewood and prepared dinner. The cabin felt warmer now, the wood stove glowing softly. Outside, a cool breeze moved through the trees, making the branches creak gently. I noticed that the shadows were long and deep. I felt a small chill but told myself it was just the cold air. That night was the first time I noticed something was off. I woke suddenly around 2 a.m. to a strange noise outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer. The sound was soft but distinct, like branches snapping or something heavy moving through the underbrush. I stayed still, listening, but it stopped after a few minutes. The silence returned. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest at night. The third day began with fog hanging low over the clearing. The mist made the trees look like shadows, and the air was damp and cold. I spent the morning chopping wood and cleaning the cabin. Later, I decided to explore a small path to the east the owner had mentioned, where an old abandoned logging road was supposed to be. I wanted to see how far I could go. The trail was narrow and overgrown. Twigs and leaves crunched under my boots as I walked slowly. The forest here was thicker, the trees growing closer together, blocking most of the sunlight. I could hear the occasional call of a crow far away and the distant sound of water flowing. After about an hour, I came to the logging road, wide and rough, covered in dead leaves and broken branches. As I followed the road, I started to feel uneasy. The silence was heavier here. There were no birds, no animals, nothing except the sound of my own footsteps. The trees seemed to close in more tightly on either side. I tried to shake the feeling and kept walking. After some time, I saw something lying on the ground near the side of the road. It looked like a torn piece of clothing, maybe an old shirt or jacket, faded and dirty. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was soaked in dirt and smelled like mold. Something about it made me nervous. I put it down quickly and stepped back. I decided to turn back, but as I looked around, I noticed the light was dimmer and the shadows longer. The forest seemed darker than before. I walked faster, my heart beating a little harder. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door and sat down, trying to calm myself. That night, the strange noises returned. This time, they were closer. I heard footsteps around the cabin, slow and deliberate, like someone was pacing. Branches scraped against the walls, and once, there was a soft thud on the roof. I stayed awake, gripping a heavy metal flashlight, watching the window, but I saw nothing, just black trees swaying in the wind. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the soft dirt outside the cabin. They were large, maybe from boots, and led around the cabin in a circle, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't want to believe someone was nearby. Maybe it was an animal or old tracks from days before. Still, the feeling of being watched was growing. I kept busy that day, gathering firewood and fixing a loose board on the porch. I made sure all the windows and doors were locked tight. I avoided going far into the woods. At night, I kept the stove fire burning bright and left the lantern on, casting warm light in the small cabin. On the fourth day, I woke to find the door unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it the night before. My stomach twisted. I searched the cabin, but nothing was missing or disturbed. Still, I felt unsafe. The idea that someone could have been inside while I slept was terrifying. I spent the day packing. I didn't want to stay here another night. I planned to leave first thing in the morning. That afternoon, as I gathered my last supplies, I heard a sudden rustle from the woods nearby. I froze, staring at the edge of the tree line. Something moved quickly between the trunks, too big to be a deer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, stepping back into the shadows. Then it disappeared. Panic rose inside me. I ran inside and locked the door, bolting it with a heavy chair. I sat on the floor, heart pounding, trying to catch my breath. I told myself to stay calm. It was probably just a hunter or someone lost, maybe looking for shelter or passing through. The area was remote, after all. That night was the worst. The footsteps returned, louder and closer. Something was circling the cabin again and again, like a predator stalking its prey. The sound of heavy breathing, low and steady, came from outside the window. I was terrified, clutching my flashlight, ready to defend myself. Hours passed like this. Every time I thought it might stop, it started again. At one point, I heard a scraping noise on the porch, like claws or a knife on wood. I screamed silently inside, but I didn't dare open the door. At dawn, the footsteps faded. Exhausted, I finally fell asleep for a few hours. When I woke, the morning light was weak but enough to see. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bags, threw on my jacket, and opened the door carefully. The porch was covered in deep scratches. The ground was littered with broken branches and fresh footprints, larger than mine. They led away into the forest, disappearing after a few yards. I didn't look back. I started the car and drove down the rough road as fast as I dared. The trees blurred past the windows, the feeling of dread slowly lifting as I reached the paved road. Back in town, I reported what happened to the local sheriff. They said it might have been a trespasser or a hunter, someone who wanted to scare me off or maybe had more dangerous intentions. They promised to check the area. It was weeks before I could sleep without feeling watched. I didn't go back to the cabin. The forest kept its secrets, but I was glad to leave them behind. Looking back, I realized how unprepared I was for the loneliness and vulnerability of being so isolated. The woods are beautiful, but they're also wild, and sometimes dangerous in ways you can't predict. The cabin sat back from the narrow gravel road, deep in the hills of the southern Appalachian Mountains. I first spotted it through a thin fog that hovered low over the brown and orange leaves of late November. I'd been driving for hours, the sun sinking behind a thick wall of tall pines and oaks. My car's headlights caught the weathered wood of the cabin's walls, gray and rough from years of rain and cold. The place looked small but solid, with a stone chimney cracked near its base and a porch cluttered with old furniture wrapped in plastic sheets. I had rented it for a week, planning to get away from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of emails and phone calls, and just finally finished the first draft of the book I'd been struggling to write for 2 years. The writer's block was suffocating, and I hoped this quiet, isolated place would push me to concentrate and find my voice again. I pulled off the road and onto a narrow dirt path. The wheels crunched on loose gravel and dried leaves, and my breath came out in small clouds from the cold air. It was chilly, just below freezing. I could smell the damp earth and pine needles, a sharp, clean scent that felt fresh after weeks in the city's smog. The front door was unlocked, as the owner had promised, and I pushed it open with a soft creak. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled like old wood and smoke. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the shafts of fading daylight that spilled through grimy windows. A rough stone fireplace dominated the main room. I found a stack of firewood near the door, damp from the rain but still usable. I dropped my bags by the door and went to light a fire. The match sparked and caught the kindling. Soon the room filled with warmth and a soft orange glow. I sat on a creaky wooden chair near the fire, looking out the window at the trees swaying in a chilly wind. The silence was complete, broken only by the crackle of burning wood. After a quick dinner of canned beans and bread, I pulled out my laptop and settled into the small desk by the window. The keyboard felt foreign in the cold air, but I typed a few words, forcing myself to start. The first hour was slow, every sentence feeling clumsy. I closed the laptop and decided to get a better fire going before night fully settled. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the old windows and stirring the dry leaves into small swirling dances across the porch. The cabin felt smaller in the darkness. I checked the locks and closed the curtains. The first night passed uneventfully except for the occasional distant howl of a coyote or rustling of leaves outside. I was asleep by 11, waking once or twice to the chill before dawn. On the second morning, I woke to the sound of heavy boots crunching through the leaves just outside. I froze, listening carefully. The footsteps stopped near the porch, and I caught the faint sound of breathing. My heart beat faster. I didn't open the door but pulled aside the curtain and peered out. Standing by the edge of the clearing was a man in a dark jacket and a knit hat, holding a large backpack. He looked rough, thin, with a scruffy beard. Our eyes met for a brief second. He nodded slightly, then moved off into the trees without a word. My mind raced. Was he a hiker, a lost hunter, or something else? The isolation of the cabin suddenly felt more dangerous. I checked the locks again and sat back by the fire, trying to calm myself. That day, I kept the windows closed tight and my knife close on the desk. The man did not return. I heard his footsteps in the distance now and then, sometimes at the edge of the trees, always just out of sight. By the third day, the weather turned worse. Rain began to fall steadily, soaking the earth and turning the dirt road into thick mud. The cabin became colder and darker. I made another fire and filled the wood basket inside, knowing the rain might keep me trapped longer than planned. At one point, I looked out the window and saw the man again, this time closer to the road. He was digging in the mud, his movements slow and careful. I couldn't understand what he was doing. I grabbed binoculars I found in a drawer and zoomed in. He seemed to be trying to free something heavy caught beneath the mud. A sudden crack of a branch startled me, and he looked up, seeing me watching. He raised a hand again, silently, then disappeared into the woods. I felt uneasy but also curious. I wondered if he needed help but was too proud to ask. That evening, as I sat writing, the power went out. Not that the cabin had electricity, but my laptop's battery was low, and my phone signal was gone since the first day. The rain hammered on the roof like a drum, and the fire was my only light and heat. The rain continued all night, and I struggled to sleep, listening to the water sliding down the roof and the occasional distant snap of a branch. On the fourth morning, the rain stopped, leaving a thick fog that blanketed the woods. The world outside was gray and silent. I decided to explore a bit, despite the warnings I'd read online about bears and other wildlife in the area. I packed a small backpack with water, some snacks, a flashlight, and my knife. I locked the cabin door behind me and stepped into the damp forest. The ground was soft and wet, leaves turning to mush beneath my boots. The fog made everything look ghostly, with twisted tree trunks looming like dark shapes. I stayed on a faint trail that wound through the trees, careful to mark my way. About half a mile in, I found an old campsite with a fire pit and some rusted cans scattered around. It looked abandoned for years. I was about to turn back when I heard the faint sound of someone moving nearby. I stopped and looked around. The fog made it hard to see, but I thought I saw the figure of a man moving behind a large oak tree. My heart jumped. I called out quietly but got no answer. There was no one else on the trail according to the map I had. I hurried back to the cabin, my senses heightened. When I reached the porch, I saw fresh footprints in the mud leading up to the door, larger than mine, rough and deep. Inside, I locked every door and window and sat by the fire all day, watching the woods through the windows. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and making the cabin groan. I kept a heavy piece of wood nearby for protection. Suddenly, around midnight, I heard a sharp knock on the front door. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, waiting for a sound to follow, but none came. I didn't open it. The knocking stopped after a minute, and then all was silent. I stayed awake, staring at the door until the first light of dawn. The next day, I found something disturbing near the cabin. On the porch, scratched into the wood with a sharp stone, were letters, a name or maybe a word. but the marks were faint and hard to read. It looked like a warning, but I wasn't sure what it meant. I debated whether to leave. The road back was muddy and rough, but I packed my bags anyway. Before I could go, I noticed the man again, standing at the edge of the woods. This time, he didn't move or look away. He simply watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but no signal. I decided to drive the car down the dirt road to the main gravel road and find a signal there. The drive was slow, the mud slick under the tires. Halfway down, the car slipped, spinning in the mud. I got out and tried to push, but the wheels just spun deeper. Frustrated and cold, I looked up and saw the man walking towards me through the woods. There was no fear in his eyes, only weariness. He came closer and, without speaking, helped me push the car free. We worked together silently until the car was back on firmer ground. As he turned to leave, I asked silently if he was okay, but he only nodded and disappeared back into the forest. I drove to the main road and found a signal to call for a tow, and then a motel. Back in town, safe and warm, I thought about the cabin and the man. He wasn't a threat, just a lonely figure struggling in the woods, like me struggling with my own troubles. The week alone had been tense and frightening, but it had forced me to face something deeper. Not ghosts or shadows, but real fear and loneliness, and the need for connection. I didn't finish the book that week, but I wrote more in those days than I had in months. Not words on a screen, but lessons in understanding and surviving real life's quiet, strange moments.